Okay, let's start this morning by playing what I'm going to call an honesty game. Remember, you're in the house of the Lord, so keep that in mind. How many of you, raise your hand if that's you, or type it on the little comment thing. How many of you think that you're smarter than the average person on planet Earth? I have a few people honest. I'll bet all of you guys are thinking about it, but you're not having a hard time raising your hand. Okay, let's try this one then. How many of you think that you are a better driver than the average person? You see, that's a hard one for me, because when I think in my incredible Mexican driving skills, I think an amazing driver. When I put that side by side with the Georgia laws, I feel more like a liability than an amazing driver. Okay, let's try a third one. How many of you think that you are a less sinful person than the average person? That you make less sins than the average person? Now, somebody has to raise your hand. I have seen your comments on Facebook when you post somebody. Somebody better be honest in here. You see, most people think they're more righteous than the other person. In other words, most people think that you are more times right than others are wrong. We may have a hard time admitting that, right? And you may be thinking, well, Pastor, it's just hard to be right all the time, right? There's so many issues and so many dumb people out there, so it's hard to be right all the time. I hear you. The struggle is real. But it's so easy just to think everybody else is wrong and you're right. We're in the sermon series called Widen the Circle. And we just heard a beautiful song of what that is. Now, I'll say this. It's very easy, or maybe not very easy, it's easier to widen the circle with somebody that looks like you, somebody that speaks like you, somebody that dresses like you, with somebody that's going to vote for the same political party that you do. It's harder to widen the circle with somebody that you don't see eye-to-eye things, that you don't see, topics the same way. How many of you guys know somebody that, regardless of the topic, they're always right? You talk about vaccines, they have the answer. You talk about wearing arms, they have the answer. You talk about gender equality, they have the answer. You talk about capitalism, they have the answer. You talk about any Bible story, they have the answer. Does any of you know somebody like that? And if you're not raising the hand, that means that you are that person to somebody else. Let me just call it out. You see, we are called to widen the circle. What we're not called is to be selective who is in the circle or not. I'm going to say that one more time. We are called to widen the circle without being selective of who gets in the circle or not. In other words, we don't have the spiritual authority to select people to come to the circle or not. Somebody thinking, how big the circle should be, how wide this circle should be. Does somebody know what the last statistics of how many people are on planet Earth? Can somebody Google it right now? How many people, what's the population of planet Earth? 7 billion or something like that, or more than that. That's how wide the circle should be. One of my kids is, right now in his class, they're looking at astrology and, the planets and the solar system and all those things. So he asked me the other day, do you think there's life beyond planet Earth? I said, buddy, I have no idea. What I do know is that we have a God that's a lot bigger than planet Earth. And I have no problem believing there's a God that can create life way beyond I can comprehend in as many universes as he can create. So the circle that we're called to widen, it is 7.7 or whatever it is, that is the population of human Earth. Because if we believe that God sent his son Jesus Christ to die for everyone, you know how many people everyone means? Everyone. I mean, if we believe that every single creature on earth, it's bearing God's image, you know what that means? Every single person on earth should be part of the circle. We don't get to pick and choose who gets in the circle or not. Some of us, we have gone through elementary school or middle school or high school, playing games like dodgeball or hide and seek and all that, and there's always that get somebody picked last. Is that true? That just sucks. It just sucks to be the last one to get picked up. And sometimes in churches, we do the same. We start picking who gets to be part of the church, and purposely or unpurposely, we let somebody there to be the last. If we ever pick them, or sometimes we don't even pick them. So how do we widen the circle? I'm glad you asked, right? And you've been wondering that question. So I'll tell you a Bible story. It comes from the Gospel according to Luke. 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Four books in the Bible telling stories about Jesus. And the context of this story, it's maybe like this. Jesus is surrounded by church people. Believe it or not, church people tends to be the ones that think they're right all the time. At least in the Bible. Probably that changed throughout history, right? Most likely. I don't think that happens today. But at least in Bible times, church people were the ones that thought they were always right, that everybody else was wrong, that they were more holier than somebody else. And in the middle of that context, with Jesus being surrounded by church people, he started telling this story. He said, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other one a tax collector. I mean, the Pharisees, they were like the real church people, right? Church employees, or somebody that really spent all their time in the church. The pastor, the musicians, the volunteers, those who were actually church people, religious people. Now, being a church person like that in Bible time was a lot harder than right now. I mean, they have roughly 613 laws that they had to follow. And believe it or not, they follow most of them. I can barely keep up with the 10 Commandments. And half the time, I don't. But that's what church people used to do, right? The Pharisees, they know, the law of God, and they follow the law of God. They saw themselves as a righteous person. And the other one was a tax collector, somebody that works for the wrong government, somebody that in his just work nature is actually doing something wrong. So you have somebody that is righteous and somebody that is unrighteous. So the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed. God, I just want to thank you that I am not like the other people, the robbers and the evildoers and the adulterers, or even this tax collector. And then he goes and gives his own spiritual resume, right? Because everybody cares about that. And he starts. You see, I fast twice a week. Now, the dude is talking to himself, right? Nobody cares. Nobody asks him how your spiritual life looks like. But then he starts. I'm just thankful that I'm not like them or like this guy. And I fast twice a week. And I give a tenth of all that I get. Yet the tax collector stood at a distance, and he wouldn't even look up to heaven. But he beat his breast, and he cried out to God, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. So Jesus goes and says, I tell you, this man, the humble one, the tax collector, the unrighteous one, went home justified rather than the Pharisee. For all those who exalt themselves will be humble, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. You see, the Pharisee, he's walking into church thinking, I'm right, he's wrong. I'm right, they're wrong. And he started having this conversation with God, believing that God sees the same way people. God, you know that I'm right, and you know that he's wrong. What he doesn't know is that Jesus don't see people as right or wrong. Jesus sees people as people. I'm going to say that one more time. Jesus don't see people as right or wrong. Jesus sees people as people. Now, that doesn't mean that people make right or wrong choices. And there are consequences with that. But that's not the lens that God sees people. You know this. I have 5 kids. I can tell you right now who makes right and wrong choices. And I know that the one that always makes wrong choices, who is like this height and is blonde, so I just narrowed out things to 2. I don't see him as a wrong boy. Like, he's my son. He's always making wrong choices. Always. Like, there's not a day that he has not made a wrong choice in his life yet. But I don't see him as wrong. He's my son, as good as the other ones that make maybe most times better choices. So why do we Christians get to see people as right or wrong? Why do we think that we can just go through life telling people, you're right, you're wrong, you're right, you're wrong? Or most of the time is, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm right, you're wrong. I was listening to a podcast a couple of days ago, and it was another pastor, and he said, Christians should be right. Because, we know the truth. And we know the truth, we should be right. We're supposed to be the light of the world, so we should be right. And I've been wrestling with that podcast because what I realize is that being right doesn't mean that you are the light. You can be right about something and be a jerk about it. And you may be making a point, but you ain't making a difference. You may be making a point about something, but you ain't making a difference. You ain't shining no light. Being right does not mean being the light. Because here's the thing. We all are sinners. I'm going to say that one more time in case I just burst somebody's bubble. We all are sinners. We all have, are, and will do things that goes away from what God wants us to do. All of us. There's only one person in the history of humanity that, if we want to use the word right, we can use that word for that person. Any idea who that may be? There's only one person that had lived without sins. And that's Jesus. That's it. So if there is just one person that can go through life actually telling people, I'm right, you're wrong, that's Jesus. And I just talk about the 4 Gospels, 4 books in the Bible that tell stories about Jesus. There is not a single story where I get an idea or a picture of an arrogant Jesus walking on earth telling people, you're wrong, I'm right. He's the only one that probably has the spiritual authority to do it, and yet he didn't do it. Look at the stories of Jesus. You may not know this story. This is a story that tells us that Jesus is walking to a town called Jericho. And there was a guy that wanted to meet Jesus. He was a tax collector. Right? He was somebody that was doing the wrong things. Called him Zacchaeus. And he was so short, and then he got into a tree. And when Jesus saw him, he had a conversation with him. Can somebody tell me in 5 seconds what that conversation was? He was, dude, get down of the tree. I'm going to your house for dinner. Just like that. He just invited himself to that house. He didn't say, hey, you on the tree, you're wrong. These are all the things that you have to do. And if you do those things, then I will go to your house for dinner. He didn't have that conversation. He was, dude, I'm going to your house. All you have to do is get off the tree. All you have to do is get down off the tree. Once I go to your house, while we eat some food, while we break some bread, then we'll let God figure out what God is going to do. And you know what happened? The Bible says that in that moment, Zacchaeus understood that there were things about his life that he needed to change. That's how Jesus engaged people. There's another story when he's sitting at the well, which is just a place where people will take water from 2,000 years ago, and a woman show up. And the story tells us that Jesus just started hearing to her story. And she started telling her story, and in her story were things and actions that Jesus didn't see well. But Jesus didn't say like, hey, stop right there. Let's just make this clear. You're wrong. Or he didn't take his phone and let's take a selfie. Go to Facebook and put it. I'm right, she's wrong. All he did was listen to her story. And it was in the listening of the story that conviction came to her heart. That's how Jesus engaged people. Now, make no mistake, so many times after engaging with people, he said, hey, you are forgiven, then go and sin no more. But it was a matter of, hey, I'm going to meet you where you are, I'm going to love you where you are, and then let God do the things in your heart that God wants to do. That's very different than, hey, let me tell you that you're wrong. Once you understand that you're wrong and all the things that you're right, now you deserve to have a conversation with me. And then now we can have this conversation. They're two complete different approaches. Jesus didn't make people feel wrong. Jesus made people feel loved. Jesus did not make people feel wrong. Now, Jesus encountered people doing wrong things, and those conversations took place, but those took place after Jesus' love on them. And all of a sudden, 2,000 years later, we have flipped that around. And we want to make sure, and I say we as Christians, we want to make sure people know that they're wrong before they can encounter Jesus. I have no idea why in the world we do that. I don't know if that makes us feel better. I don't know if we just have this tendency of trying to exclude somebody. But it may be how in the world we flip that around. That we have to tell somebody, you're wrong, so then you can experience Jesus. You see, perhaps the most important Bible verse in the Bible, it comes in John 13. And for some of you guys who may like to memorize Bible verses, in a couple of minutes I'll tell you one that if anything, you memorize that one, right? That's the one thing that you want to know. That's the ABC, right, of school. Then you can put up together words together as you go on. So let me give you the context, right, of that story. It says in verse 1 that Jesus knew that his time was come to leave this world and go to the Father, right? So this happening on Thursday night, the night that Jesus got arrested. He's having what we call the Last Supper with his disciples. He's having that conversation with them. He knows crucifixion is just right around the corner in less than 12 hours or so. Having loved his own who were in the world. Gosh, I just love this verse. He loved them until the end. So they're sitting at the table, and I'll burst another bubble. I don't think they were sitting at a long table, like the Da Vinci picture when everybody was just like this, kind of like that. I don't think it happened like that. Most likely they were sitting on the ground, in a circle, probably way. And at some point, Jesus stood up. And he went and grabbed some water and a towel and started washing their feet. And the disciples got all, upset about that because masters don't do that. Teachers don't do that. Servants do that. And they said, Jesus, you can't do that. And Jesus said, I'm going to do it. And he starts doing that. And he starts telling them that he's about to die. And the disciples start getting also very frantic about it. And Judas start kind of like arguing with Jesus. And Jesus said, Judas, why don't you go and do what you're going to do? And he goes. And the story tells us that he goes to betray Jesus. And he keeps telling his disciples, I'm going to get crucified. And the disciples say like, no, Jesus, we're going to be here with you until the end. And we're here for you. And I'm sure they meant it. And Jesus said like, no, you guys, you won't. I mean, sadly, you won't. And then in the next couple of verses, as Jesus is having a conversation with them, for the first time in the Gospels, Jesus uses a phrase that to refer to them that he hasn't used before, right? Say, my children. Right? The word in Greek that he uses is children, which in the past, Jesus has never referred to his disciples as children. So the tone of that conversation changed. It's almost like God speaking to them. And then he uses another word, said, I'm going to give you a fresh commandment, a new commandment, something that hasn't worn out. And then he goes and says this, love each other just as I love you. As I'm loving you right now, right, humbly, sacrificially. That makes no sense. Go and love one another like that. So you also must love each other. And then this is powerful. He said, this is how everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. He didn't say, you know how people will know that you're my disciples? If you're always right. He didn't say, hey, if you're always right and you tell people that they're always wrong, that's how people will be drawn to me. Go and do it. He said, just go and love one another. And there's two approaches to this. If you start this from the approach that you are right, that leads to arrogance, right? I mean, you think that you're spiritually superior to somebody else, right? That leads to arrogance. And what arrogance leads in just to judgment to others. And what that leads is to pushing people away from Jesus. It's a very, very thin line, right? Thinking, okay, I'm right, then you're wrong. And I'm better than you. And because of that, I'm going to tell you that you're wrong. People won't get to know Jesus. But if you flip it, and if you start seeing things from the perspective that, gosh, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but what I know that I am is I am forgiven. And if I'm forgiven, I'm grateful that God forgave me. And if I'm grateful that God forgave me, goodness, I can extend grace for God to forgive somebody else. And if you extend that grace, that's how people get closer to Jesus. There's two different approaches in Christianity. You can start with righteousness, arrogance, judgment, and pushing people away from Jesus. Or you can start by understanding that you are forgiven. That at some point, the light came on you. That not only you were wrong in the past or you were doing bad choices, you're still doing them, you're still a sinner. But because you are forgiven, you can experience that grace. And when you experience that grace, you can share that with others. And when you share that with others, people get to encounter Jesus. So I asked this morning, who is God inviting you to widen the circle to? Who is that person that perhaps has a different path of life than yours? That you may not understand why he or she makes decisions about life. Maybe she parent different than you parent. Maybe he or she sees finances different than you do. Maybe he even pray in a different way that you don't ever understand. Who is God calling you to widen the circle? Who is God calling you to meet where they are? To start with love and start with grace. And then let God do what God can do. God's still in the changing lives business. He didn't stop with you. He didn't quit with you. God is still changing lives. Let's just don't get on the way. I'll finish with this. Some of you guys are parents of preschoolers, right? We have a preschooler now. Now, finally, we can say that. I'm saying that before he gets kicked out of preschool, right? Who knows? But with preschoolers, with little kids, right? If you ask them to draw a circle, and you guys may have seen it, right, with your kids or grandkids, etc. It ain't going to be a pretty circle. But they know the concept that at the end of the day, it's going to be like this. They won't draw a line. God is not asking us to make a pretty circle. But God is asking us to make a circle. Make no mistake about that.